It was the summer of 1971. Sarah was a young woman who loved to travel and hike. She set out to explore the beauty of Sequoia National Park. She wanted to see the towering redwood trees and the untouched wilderness. But soon after her hike began, something strange happened. The forest seemed to come alive and it whispered her name. Sarah tried to ignore it and focused on getting back to the trail, but when she turned around, the trail disappeared and she was surrounded by forest. She couldn't see through the trees. The forest had consumed her. She could barely see her hand in front of her face, and the trees wavered in the unseen wind. The rustles of the leaves were like hisses, and the chirping birds turned to bone-chilling screams. The forest was alive and took sinister twists and turns, taking Sarah further and further away from safety. She yelled over and over for help, but none came. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah was never found. Eventually, her family reported her missing, and a search rescue crew looked for her for weeks, but came up with nothing. It seemed she became part of a statistic of missing persons. The forestry and sheriffs believed she might have been attacked and eaten by a wild mountain lion. However, there was no evidence to support that. As time went on, everyone had given up hope of finding her alive, and the idea of such wild terrain had been blamed for her disappearance. It was as if Sarah had vanished into thin air. Time had passed and people moved on with their lives. It was now 1991, and Jessica had arrived at Sequoia National Park. She was fresh out of college and eager to explore and sightsee. She loves to hike, and in fact was experienced. She had heard about the disappearance of people in the national parks, particularly the one about a young woman named Sarah in 1971. Contrary to reports of an infamous tragic story revolving around the park's history, she sets out on the same path as Sarah once did. As Jessica ventured deeper into the forest, she suddenly heard a voice calling her name. It sounded like a young woman. The forest grew dark, and shadows morphed into shapes. The trees twisted into ghostly figures of the long dead. The whispers echoed through the branches, and Jessica tasted a hint of fear in the air. Lightning flashed, thunder roared, and the wind turned into a deafening howl. Jessica spun around, scanning for the source of the voice. Suddenly, she saw Sarah right in front of her, reaching out, begging her to help. But how can that be? Sarah hadn't aged. She looked just like the original missing picture poster from 1971. Her clothes weren't torn up, she wasn't dirty. How can that be? Jessica thought. Nevertheless, Jessica was terrified, gripping at straws, and ran to grab Sarah's hand. But as she reached for her, Sarah argued, "It will take you too." Jessica felt a sudden panic, and Sarah and Jessica ran through the trail back to the edge of the forest where her car was parked. As Jessica was unlocking her car, she said, "That was scary. I'm glad we got out of there. Now let's take you home." But just as Jessica turned around, the forest with twisted branches and leaves suddenly grabbed Sarah and pulled her back into the forest. Jessica was terrified as she heard a deep voice say, "Sarah is mine." Then all that echoed through the empty forest was the sound of Sarah's voice saying, "Help me. Please. It has me." Jonathan had always been fascinated by the Wild West. So, when he found out about Silver City Ghost Town on his trip to California, he was excited to visit. He had never believed in ghosts, and he scoffed at the stories of hauntings and paranormal activity at the site. As he walked the deserted streets of the old town, he felt a chill in his bones. The buildings looked run down and abandoned, but there was something eerie about them. He felt like he was walking among the spirits of those who had died in the town. He wandered into the old saloon, where he decided to take a seat at the bar. He ordered a drink and struck up a conversation with the bartender. The bartender told him stories of the town's dark past, how it had been overrun by bandits and lawlessness. He talked about the hangings, the gunfights, and the deaths that had occurred here. Jonathan listened intently, but he still didn't believe in ghosts. He thought that the stories were just exaggerated legends, nothing more. As night began to fall, Jonathan decided to explore the town further. He walked down the main street, past the old general store and the blacksmith shop. He thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, but dismissed it as a trick of the light. He heard strange creaking sounds coming from the abandoned buildings. He could hear whispers in the air, voices that seemed to be coming from all around him. The wind howled through the empty streets, and the sound echoed like the mournful cries of the town's ghosts. He walked towards the old church, where he felt a strange pull. As he entered the church, he felt a heavy coldness in the air. The candles on the altar flickered and went out, and the room was plunged into darkness. Suddenly, he heard footsteps coming from behind him. He turned around but saw no one there. He heard footsteps again, but they kept getting closer. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, and he felt a sudden gust of cold wind pass by him. Then, he saw something that made him believe in ghosts. It was an apparition of a woman in a white dress, floating towards him. She had long hair and a pleading expression on her face. He could see through her, and he felt the chill of her presence. He stumbled backward, tripping over his feet, and fell to the ground. When he looked up, the apparition was gone, and the room was lit again. He was alone. Jonathan ran from the church as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew now that the stories were true. Silver City Ghost Town was haunted. Maggie and Ryan were always up for a good ghost hunt. They enjoyed exploring abandoned buildings and investigating haunted locations. So when they heard about the Oak Flat Lookout Tower in California, they immediately embarked on a hike to explore the tower. The Oak Flat Lookout Tower was an old fire tower that had been abandoned for years. It sat atop a high peak in the middle of a forest, overlooking miles of wilderness. The forest was dense, and the trail was difficult to navigate. As they hiked, they began to feel uneasy. The trees seemed to loom over them, and the sun disappeared quickly behind the thick canopy. The only noises they could hear were the sound of their footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. As they neared the tower, Maggie stopped in her tracks. She felt like something was watching them. Ryan laughed it off, telling her that it was probably just an animal. But as they continued, they both had an unsettling feeling that they were being followed. As they reached the tower, they noticed that it was old, rusted, and covered in vines. The tower looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The surrounding trees looked twisted and ominous. They set up camp nearby and began their investigation of the tower. They used their ghost hunting equipment, and Maggie took photographs of the surroundings. They felt like they weren't alone, like something was watching them. As they delved deeper into the tower, they began to feel a sense of foreboding. The air was thick and musty, and the metal stairs creaked and groaned underfoot. They began to hear voices, whispers in the shadows that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "Maggie, do you hear that?" whispered Ryan. "What? The voices?" replied Maggie, her voice trembling. "Yeah, and there's something else. I can feel it." They both knew that something wasn't right, but they pushed forward, determined to uncover the truth. As the night wore on, they conducted an EVP session. They asked the ghost questions, but no one answered. The tower was silent except for the sound of their breathing, but then they heard footsteps coming up the ladder. They quickly turned around, but nobody was there. The footsteps continued, getting louder and closer. Suddenly, the ladder began to shake violently, and the tower filled with a cold draft. They heard whispers and saw orbs of light appearing out of nowhere. Maggie and Ryan were terrified. They huddled together, their hearts racing. They knew that they weren't alone, that something was with them in the tower. They could feel its presence, watching them, waiting for them. They tried to leave, but the ladder wouldn't budge. They were trapped, surrounded by the spirits of the rangers who had died in the tower. They could hear their screams, their cries for help. They felt like they were going insane, that the ghosts were reaching into their minds and pulling them apart. Finally, in the morning, they managed to escape. They fled down the mountain as quickly as they could, never looking back. They knew that they had had a close brush with something beyond their understanding, something that had left them forever changed.